Very good. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. Today's webinar is Introduction to Kiuwan API. So accessing Kiwan via the API. My name is JD Burke. I'm a sales engineer with Kiwan. You can read about how wonderful I am there. In the background, you don't see it today, but is Aaron Martinez. So he's my counterpart in Europe, and he will be monitoring the Q&A channel, helping us with any of the questions we have. Before we get too far into today's webinar, let's go over some of the ground rules. So this is going to be a fairly short webinar. It's very straightforward. We're planning on about 45 minutes. There'll be about 30 minutes of discussion and a chance at the end to answer any questions that might have come up. So having said that, please send us your questions. There's a Q&A panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. So you can type your questions in there, and as I said, Aaron will try and field those or answer those questions in real time. And then any questions that come up that we have not gotten to, we'll try and circle around and answer at the end. So this webinar is being recorded. So for those of you that registered, you will get a link to the recording so you can play it back and see everything that we're doing today and share it with others in your organization that may not have gotten it the first time. The agenda today is fairly straightforward and simple. Tell you a little bit about us, an overview of SAS and SCA briefly. We'll look at the Kiwan Swagger file, which is a way to use our access or our API or generate endpoints from our API. Well, then we'll actually jump into the code and look at some code samples, look at our API documentation and actually put it to work and do some actions. And then from there, we'll jump into questions and answers. So a little bit about us. Kiwan is a global company owned by a larger company called Adira. So Kiwan does application security. So we do SAST and SCA. Adira, who owns us, also does a bunch of other things. We're part of the DevOps group, and that includes TestRail, Assembler, Ranorex, Travis CI, Preemptive, who does code obfuscation. So we're a pretty good company. So when you want to do any kind of DevOps or work with software generation, databases, security, we either do it or we know somebody who does. Kiwan itself is specifically a SAST tool. So SAST is static application security testing. So that's where we scan your source code looking for patterns that represent vulnerabilities. We also do software composition analysis, SCA, which is where we look at third-party and open source packages used in your source code. Give you an idea of their health and the risk that they might present to your code base. If you do not have access to Kiwan today, that's okay. I'll be doing all the work today, so you can just watch me work. But if you want to know more about Kiwan and perhaps get a trial account or something like that so you can test out what we're doing, you can contact us. The coordinates to contact us will be shown later on at the end of the presentation, and request a free trial. For those of you that do have access to Kiwan today, we'll be using API documents and user manuals that are available at those two URLs there. So our user manuals are available on our documentation site. And in there, if you search through the documentation site, you'll see a reference to our REST API. And you can click through on that and you'll get taken to the web page that we're going to be using later, which lists out all the endpoints that we're going to be looking at. So Kiwan conforms to an open API Swagger model. So depending on how old you are, you might call it Swagger. You can go to as I said, you can go to our documentation site. You can search for REST API and you will be taken to our REST API pages, which includes a link to our REST API JSON, the Swagger JSON. You can download that Swagger JSON and then use the Swagger code gen module to generate libraries for Kiwan. And I'll show you a little bit how to do that, how to install the CodeGen package and call the CodeGen with the input of the JSON file you downloaded from us, flag the language that you want to output to, and then the output target. Then you run that. The Swagger is consumed and generates endpoints and some other documentation for that Swagger. I'll forewarn you, today we're not actually going to be using the Swagger method to code. I'll do a lower level, just crafting Python, for example, or showing you some curls without a lot of this extra Swagger helper code. So if you choose to go the Swagger route, like I said, you can go to our website, you can download the Swagger JSON. You can install CodeGen, so you can go to Open API and read on how to install the package for your operating system. In my case, I'm on a Mac, so I get away with just running brew and installing the Swagger CodeGen. From there, you can instantiate a Swagger CodeGen and pass it the JSON file and the output in the language you want to transcode the Swagger file into, and then it outputs a series of documents and deliverables that you can use when you actually craft your own code. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what that looks like. So I've done some of this already. And when you run the CodeGen, what happens is you consume the JSON and you get back a series of markdown documents that list out the endpoints, a series of requirements that are additional packages that are encouraged to be added to your IDE if you're going to fully exercise any of the endpoints in the Kiuwan API. Then you get a series of includes that you can, and modules that you can start to reference from that Swagger. So as I said earlier, we're not actually going to do that today. I'm not going to mess with these today. We're doing a little bit simpler direct call of the APIs. But I'll show you that here in a minute when we get into my IDE. The Open API Swagger for Kiwan is available at that address. And as I showed you in my Finder window, when you run that, you get a series of deliverables that you can add to your IDE and make your life a little bit easier. Now, being as intelligent as I am, I choose not to do the easy way. And I end up doing it a different way. And that way is, instead of using the Swagger IO CodeGen module, and let me pull up my instance of Kiwan. Oops, I just lost it. Hold on. I choose to go to the API documentation. So recall, you can go to kiwan.com and you can go to the product documentation page. Click on resources, product documentation. And that will take you to our user guides. And from there, you can search for REST API. Go to there. And that will take you to our API site, including the Swagger document that we're talking about for the Open API code gen. The way we're going to do this today, in today's webinar, is I will actually go straight to the endpoints. And do this directly from the IDE. And what we'll be doing is we'll be coming to our API documentation page. And from here, you can see the endpoints. And as you might expect, you can start to read about those endpoints and how to instantiate or invoke those endpoints, including later on models, data models, for what to pass and what to return from those endpoints. We give some amount of examples on how to use the API in various languages. So as you might expect, it's very straightforward. In the case of a curl, that we end up just passing authentication tokens to a URL as a header. And then from there, you get your return object. In my case today, we'll be doing something similar to this, where we'll actually be, instead of importing the Swagger client, I'll just be building the header explicitly and then packaging the URL with the native request import and passing data that way. And then that will take us to our Kiwan instance. And I'll show you how that impacts, how we're able to change the settings inside our Kiwan instance with our API interactions. All right, so having said that, let's actually take a look at some of my code here. Paint my screen a little bit. All right, so what I've done is I've set up PyCharm. I'm going to be coding today in Python. It's my preferred language. And I've got several very simple examples so that we can illustrate how to exercise those APIs. So in the first case, I have an interest to understand what users are logged into Kiwan. So there are some user cases that we uncover occasionally where customers want to use Kiwan and they want to enable SSO on their system. So it's not uncommon for customers wanting to return the list of users that already exist in Kiwan. So in this particular case, I've written a little bit of Python here that uses requests and the JSON objects. And I went over to the REST API and I found this users endpoint. And you can do something similar where you look up the user endpoint and start to see the possible verbs under the user endpoint. And in this case, I want to get a list of users, and that's done with a simple get of the /users. So I'm doing a request get of the API URL for the user's endpoint. In this particular case, I'm using a basic authentication where I'm passing in my username and my password. There are other ways you can do this, but for today's example, I'm using this disposable username and password to make it a little bit easier for you to see what's going on. And then I get a response back. And because I'm using requests, the request method, I get a response. I pull the text from that and then cast it as a JSON and then print that out for you. So you'll see this pattern repeatedly in the examples we're going to be performing, that all we're doing is pulling this URL, which is the API at Kiwan, and then targeting selected endpoints. And depending on whether we're doing a get or a push or post, whether we pull data as a JSON so we can mangle it and unpack it and use it later on, or pushing a payload, generating a payload, putting it into the object, and then pushing it up. You'll see that here in a minute. In this particular case, this is pretty straightforward. And you can see processing that. I pulled back a JSON with a list of usernames, just as you saw on the Kiwan user page. So continuing on with that user story, when customers have expressed an interest in turning on SSO in Kiwan, sometimes they want to know or have the power to pull back who are the users already in the system. The next thing one might want to do is to add a user to the system. So once again, you can check the API documentation and you can see that we're doing a post this time, and you can get an idea of what the data model is for pushing data to execute that post to create a user. And that data model, if you follow that link, takes you down to this list of data models down here. And what that says is that for this endpoint, that API and endpoint, go ahead and pass your authentication in your headers, and then pass a payload per that data model. And you can digest that and read more about the specific variables, but in this case, they're very straightforward, where we're creating a username, or essentially passing all the information that you would have passed if you had added the user by clicking on the new user button. So in this case, I'm hard coding the values, but of course, in your case, you could create some kind of connector to your list of users and pull back your own user particulars and populate those fields with those values. And then I pass that once again into the request, where I'm doing a post this time to that URL with that authentication, and I'm passing the payload that I crafted above. And surprise, what's going to happen here is that when I run this, I get a result back that you can query and build into your exception handling. And then if I refresh the page, I should have picked up a new user here with the settings that I defined in the payload. The other corner of the SSO use case, create or get the list of users, add a user, then perhaps you want to delete a user. And as you might expect, it's very straightforward, going once again to that endpoint. Then we're going to pass a delete action with the variable that we want to pass. So in this case, the URL with at the delete with the username. And in this case, go ahead and run that. Once again, we got back a result code. And if we did this correctly, John Smith should disappear. And now we've had the ability to read what users we have, add a user, and delete a user. This, once again, this is probably going to be a pretty handy set of functions when you want to try and implement SSO and automate it to make a more robust, fully automated workflow between your Active Directory or your authenticator, IDP, and Kiwan. There are other, what you will start to figure out when you come to Kiwan and you start to do users management, you start to figure out that Kiwan is RBAC, so roles-based authentication or access control. So we have the concept of user groups and roles. So for those user stories I was talking about, you can also start to create groups and add groups. For example, in this particular case, I'm getting the user groups, so that's very similar to the get users. Now I'm getting the groups that are listed. And you can pull that back and be presented with a JSON once again with the different user groups and the members of those user groups. And you can start to add on these layers of complexity to enrich your integrations. In this particular case with users, but whatever actions you want to perform will all be similar. So if you want to create your own list of portfolios, if you want to pull back your list of components that are in the SCA model, what we call insights, you can do that. If you want to pull back your scans and generate your own reports based off of those scans, you could easily pull back the data from the analyses and then cast those into a PDF generator or even pull our own PDF that we generate. Enrich that data that comes back with additional information from your system and generate additional reports on the fly. All that can be done from these endpoints that we're exercising or starting to exercise today. So following on from the get user group, you can also create a user group. So if you wanted to create a user group, let's say we want to call it my new group 2. Very straightforward. And then from there, you can start to populate the group with members. This is all in lead up to the notion of stitching more power into your DevOps pipeline. So currently, the running of a SAST scan, what we call code security, by your DevOps pipeline is a fairly high-powered evolution. So that agent, that plugin that goes into your pipeline has pretty strong roles to generate scans for your applications. So one thing you might want to do is create a user group for your DevOps and your CI bots, and then you can use things like add users to populate that bot group either on the fly with an ephemeral user that you delete or trash once you have it do the scan to close up the hole or the security softness that you may have enabled by giving that bot powers. And then you can add add that user to the user group and then manipulate the roles that the user group has access to, turning on and turning off roles on the fly as appropriate. So least privilege only at the time of use. The other thing you can do is start creating applications. So recall when you scan your code into Kiwan, one of the first things you do is you create this holder for the results. So in Kiwan code security, for example, if I'm scanning an application, I create this placeholder to hold the results of the scan. And then I do the scan, and then the analysis gets pushed up and put into that holder. So you can use the APIs to generate a series of code, to have your CI go ahead and run the Kiwan local analyzer, which actually does these scans, create these accounts on the fly if needed, perform the scan and put the results in that result container if you want. And then in this particular case, using a situation like this, I can have DevOps pull the application name when it gets run. So I can have my CI pull the application name variable or the branch name, put it into my scan metadata, so the details around this information, and create these scans on the fly. And that allows you to get away with not having significant foreknowledge of what you're scanning before you actually get to CI, and CI pulls the branch of whatever the latest work was. And in this particular case, as you saw before, I just generated a payload with the variables. This payload is per the model for the data model for this endpoint. So if we go back over here to applications, you can start to get an idea of what data model you need to populate from to build your payload to actually create an entry here to put your results into. All right, so let's review a little bit. I told you that you can go to Kiuwan.com and the product documentation page under the resources tab, and you can search there for the REST API documentation, and eventually you'll get to a page like this where you get several things. One, you get an overview that describes our approach to the APIs. You'll get a link to our Swagger, so our JSON file, so that you can, if you are that type of programmer, you can download CodeGen and you can create the Swagger for your IDE and load that up and then start to instantiate your code from there. Or you can do it similar to how I did it, where you review the left-hand side and look at the endpoints and decide which values you need from there, and then get the endpoint. And if there is any data model that's applicable, review that to see how to build the payload. And then you can start up your IDE and then start to craft together your code object to exercise the API and manage the data, the Kiwan data and the deliverables like you would like to do. And in our particular case today, I took you through some sample code that I think might be helpful if you are a person who is trying to integrate SSO into Kiwan so that you can get users, you can add users, you can delete users. And then we dipped our toe into the a little bit more sophisticated use cases where we started to create user groups. And from there, you would do your own research and then start to add users to user groups. And hopefully around that time, you started to figure out that it's very straightforward and that we're just going to be calling this URL with these endpoints and packing together a payload if necessary and sending that up. So let me take us out of here, back to our presentation. So that brings us to that part of the webinar where we would open this back up for questions. Let me see if I can find my colleagues here and see if there are any questions that we can answer or anything that came in. All right, Aaron, do you have any questions that we need to cover?
No, so far we are good, no questions. It seems that everything is very clear. But as JD mentioned, if you have any inquiry or any, and we have one question here. And the question comes from Jesus Gutierrez, and the question is if it's possible to unmute effects by the API.
That is a good question. Let me. So Jesus, I don't know the answer to that exactly. Let's just take a moment and see what I would do. So you can, I told you can go to the API documentation and actually let's do it this way. Control F. And I think the answer to your question is yes. Unfortunately, there is a couple of mutes, a couple of references to mutes. I'm going to figure out which one it is. But I think the answer is yes. And what you want to do is do something similar to what I did. Go to the documentation, search for mute. So this is the API documentation. Search for the mute endpoints. And then that's probably in the vulnerabilities endpoint. So let's see. I think there's actually an endpoint here called vulnerabilities. And then it toggle the vulnerability from true to false. But the short of it is, Jesus, unfortunately, I've never done that, so I don't know. And I think the answer is yes, and that the answer is via our documentation here. Are there any other questions?
Not so far.
That's a good one. I'll have to actually try that and see if I can turn a mute on and off. All right, so as Aaron said, you can contact us at contact@kiwan.com. As I said earlier on, there is a option for a trial if you want. So you can contact us and play along at home and take Kiwan for a test drive. This webinar is recorded and will be sent out to you shortly as soon as we get through transcoding it, once we finish up here. And then if you have any questions at all, you can come back to our any of our coordinates and ask your questions and get a chance to get geeked up with us. So until then, we'll wish everybody a happy day and stay safe. And let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you on the next Kiwan webinar. Thank you.